Well, I use a form of philosophical counseling which is called logic-based therapy, which I've started developing in the mid 1980s and have been working since. It has its basis in rational emotive behavior therapy, and I worked with Dr. Albert Ellis, and so it's heavily influenced by REBT, and REBT was one of the first cognitive. It was indeed the first cognitive behavior therapy devised, and LBT is different from REBT in the sense that it's much more philosophically endowed and has more logic in it, thus the name logic-based therapy, than REBT, where, according to Ellis, it utilizes a stoic construct that it's not the events in your life that upset you, but it's rather the beliefs. So you have a belief system and an activating event, and the belief system together with the activating event cause the behavioral and emotional consequence. Well, what LBT does is it syllogizes that. It speaks not in terms of causal relationships, but rather in terms of conclusions, premises, and conclusions. So, for instance, one gets fired from the job, and it's not the event of getting fired from the job together with the belief system that causes the consequences of an emotion like depression, for instance. It's rather a syllogistic inference from, for instance, if I'm fired from my job, then I'm worthless. I was fired from my job, therefore I'm worthless. And that's, recognizable as what has come to be called the practical syllogism. And so it looks for the premises, that are creating the emotional problem. And practical syllogisms also can be explored because, behind the premises of the primary syllogism, the example that I just gave, are other syllogisms that chain to them. So, for instance, if I'm fired from my job, then I'm worthless. I was fired from my job, therefore I'm worthless. One could ask, well, why is it that being fired from your job makes you worthless? Why do you hold that major premise in the first place? And then, there may be a response that ultimately might lead to something like, well, I really I can't fail at anything. I must always succeed at whatever I try, and especially, for instance, things that are so important like, jobs and stuff. Therein lies a higher order premise, from which I'm deducing, my self-defeating damnation of oneself. And oftentimes we find, these demands for perfection, this perfectionistic demands that undergird, irrational emotions, self-defeating emotions. But where LBT differs from REBT is that not only does it look at the irrational thinking, it also looks at a way out of those irrational thinking chains. So it connects with a kind of positive psychology for which it uses an Aristotelian theory of virtue. So for each of the irrational modes of thinking, the fallacies rooted in the practical syllogisms are corresponding virtues. In the previous syllogism, I'm a failure, I'm worthless, because I lost my job. Um, there's the virtue of self-respect, which is unconditional self-acceptance, and so a client, who has that kind of thinking will need to work on self-acceptance. Now, how do you work on those things? Here's where LBT that's very diversified in its philosophical approaches because different people see these virtues differently. For instance, if I were a deeply religious person, then I might come to see, self-respect in terms of respecting myself as a child of God, for instance. So I might, be looking at something on the order of St. Thomas Aquinas as a philosopher that, I would feel comfortable with. So we look for resonance in what philosophies work for clients in adjusting, in interpreting and supporting their guiding virtues, as it's called in LBT. So it's self-respect. And then the last step of the process is to apply, that philosophy, which means that, let's say it's a Nietzschean concept, that respect for me is recognizing the empowerment through the suffering, that I've endured, and I see myself as rising above it. So, what things are you going to change in your life in order to rise above, the misfortunes, like losing one's job? Well, you know what? I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to do some new things in my life. So we work on those things. So it's cognitive and restructuring your belief system, and it's behavioral. So essentially, what happens is we construct a new positive syllogistic chain, which leads to other behavioral implications in terms of applying it, like going back to school, or enlisting in a different type of work, or trying different things in one's life and exploring one's talents and so forth. So there's all different types of behavioral exercises and so forth that one could do, to strengthen the practice.